When the Council tested humanity, Earth did not flinch. The signal arrived at 3:47 Universal Time Coordinated on a Tuesday in late November. It wasn't beamed toward any single antenna or relay station. It came in simultaneously across 17 of Earth's deep space monitoring arrays, from the Atacama Plateau to the Siberian SETI network to the orbital receivers parked in Sun-Earth L2. The signal was coherent, directional, and encoded in a mathematical structure so deliberate that it could not have been noise. 16 minutes after the first detection, the Unified Space Monitoring Consortium confirmed it was artificial. 6 hours later, the UN Security Council convened in closed session. 22 hours after that, the message was decoded. It was not a greeting. The decoding team, a joint effort between linguists, astrophysicists, and cryptographers from 11 nations, worked in rotating shifts inside a secure facility beneath the ESA Coordination Center in Darmstadt, Germany. The message was layered. The outer layer was mathematical: primes, base 10 counting sequences, geometric ratios. Standard first contact protocol. Humanity had anticipated this much. But the second layer was different. It contained a map, a star chart, rendered in a coordinate system that took 3 days to reverse engineer. The chart showed Earth's solar system highlighted. Around it, a series of concentric boundary zones were marked with what analysts ultimately translated as categories. The innermost boundary was labeled in a term that roughly translated to quarantine zone or unregistered territory. The outer boundaries indicated escalating degrees of observation, monitoring, and finally, jurisdiction. Humanity had been living inside someone else's administrative map. The third layer of the signal was the part that kept Admiral Yekaterina Voloshin awake at night. She was director of the newly reorganized Earth Defense Coordination Authority, an institution that had existed largely on paper until 3 years prior, when it had been quietly expanded after a series of unexplained sensor anomalies in the outer solar system had been classified at the highest levels. She had pushed for the expansion. She had argued, in front of committees that tried their hardest to look bored, that humanity needed a credible defense posture before it needed a diplomatic one. Now she read the third layer's translation 3 times. Acknowledge. Confirm registration. Await inspection. Non-compliance will be corrected. There were no pleasantries. No context. No offer of reciprocal communication. Just the bureaucratic language of a structure that had evidently been operating without Earth's awareness, or consent, for some time. She set the printout down. Around the table, 12 analysts and 4 senior government liaisons stared at it with expressions ranging from disbelief to a very particular kind of fear. Not the fear of the unknown, but the fear of suddenly understanding exactly where you stood. So, said Dr. Imani Osei, the lead decoder, her voice careful and precise, they've been watching us. For how long? Someone asked. Osei folded her hands. Based on the astronomical notation in the boundary maps, the quarantine designation appears to have been assigned approximately 240 years ago. She paused. Give or take a decade. The room was quiet. What followed over the next 72 hours was the most consequential series of decisions in human history, made by people who had almost no time to make them. Earth's position was diplomatically unprecedented. The signal contained no identification, no indication of the sender's species, and no coordinates for a reply. It was, in diplomatic terms, a notice served without a return address. The phrasing, "non-compliance will be corrected," was unambiguous in tone, whatever interpretive latitude one might assign to the specific words. The Strategic Advisory Board recommended 2 parallel tracks. The first was diplomatic: construct a formal acknowledgement using the signal's own mathematical encoding structure, something that communicated awareness and intelligent engagement without either defiance or capitulation. The second track was military: begin immediate, quiet mobilization of Earth's orbital and near-space defense assets. Both tracks were approved within the same 12-hour window. EDCA began repositioning its 17 active patrol vessels, small, crude ships designed primarily for asteroid monitoring and debris management, but capable of operating in coordinated formation. It was not a fleet in any meaningful military sense. But they were real ships with real crews, and they could be positioned. Admiral Voloshin authorized the repositioning personally. She also authorized something else: the activation of 43 unmanned monitoring probes that had been sitting in storage at the Lunar Coordination Depot since the previous year's budget standoff had delayed their deployment. They would be launched within 60 hours, distributed across a broad sensor arc extending from the Moon's L4 point to the outer edge of the asteroid belt. It was, by any honest accounting, a thin line. Enormously thin. but it was a line. "We don't know what they're sending," she said to her chief of operations, Commander Daisuke Tanaka, as they reviewed the deployment schedule in the early hours of the third morning after the signal. "We don't know when they're sending it. We don't know what correcting noncompliance actually means to them." "No," Tanaka agreed. "But we're going to know where it is the moment it enters our system. And they're going to know we know." She looked at the deployment map. "That matters." "Does it?" he asked, not challenging her. Genuinely uncertain. She thought about it for a moment. It mattered at sea. It mattered in the air. It mattered every single time a smaller force stood in front of a larger one and said, "We see you." I'm not ready to believe the physics of that has changed just because the distance is measured in astronomical units now. What neither of them knew yet, what no one on Earth knew, was that the signal had not been the beginning. It had been a notification. The inspection fleet had already departed. They expected submission. Earth's silence was misread as compliance. The Galactic Council, as it would eventually come to be called in Earth's records, though the accurate translation of its name was closer to the Compact of Observed Systems, was not a hostile organization by its own self-understanding. This was important to grasp, and Earth's analysts would spend considerable time grappling with it. The Council was old. Not in the way that human institutions are old, measured in centuries shaped by war and reformation and collapse. The Council was old in the way that geological formations are old, persistent, layered, and largely indifferent to any individual event occurring within its timeframe. It had been administering the registration and classification of emergent civilizations in this region of the galaxy for what its own records described as approximately 14,000 standard cycles. A unit of time that, once converted, worked out to roughly 11,000 years in Earth's calendar. In that time, it had processed 112 civilizations. Of those, 61 had achieved what the Council termed registered status, a formal acknowledgement of their existence and a defined set of parameters governing their expansion and interaction with the wider galactic community. 37 had been classified as pre-emergent and placed under monitoring protocols. 9 had failed to survive their own development phase, for reasons the Council did not elaborate upon. 5 had been corrected. Earth's analysts, when they eventually obtained these figures through a combination of decoded transmissions and painstaking mathematical inference, sat with that last number for a very long time. The inspection fleet that had departed for Earth's solar system consisted of 12 vessels. This was, by Council standards, a routine deployment. The fleet had been assembled and dispatched within 3 cycles of Earth's signal threshold being crossed, the point at which a civilization's electromagnetic emissions became complex enough to qualify as intentional communication. Earth had crossed that threshold, by the Council's calculation, approximately 80 years ago. The signal sent to Earth was not an initiation of contact. It was a procedural step that had been pending in an administrative queue. The fleet commander was a Council official designated in translation as the Senior Inspector of Unregistered Systems, 4th Meridian Sector, a title that conveyed bureaucratic rank rather than military authority. The fleet was not equipped for combat in any primary sense. It carried compliance enforcement capabilities because all Council inspection fleets did. But it was fundamentally a bureaucratic instrument. This was, in retrospect, the source of the fundamental miscalculation. The Council's models for civilizational behavior at this stage of development were based on 112 data points. Every civilization they had encountered at the pre-registration phase had behaved in one of 2 ways upon receiving the Council's notification. Either they had responded with some form of acknowledgement, radio signals, mathematical encoding, and attempt at communication, or they had gone quiet. The quiet ones, in the Council's experience, were not preparing resistance. They were processing fear. Their silence was compliance of a slower kind. Earth had gone quiet. Senior Inspector Velharith reviewed Earth's non-response in his ship's operations center as the fleet crossed the outer boundary of the solar system. The planet had received the notification. Its electromagnetic output had shifted after receipt. The pattern of emissions changed measurably, in ways consistent with internal political reorganization and concentrated military communications traffic. This was normal. This was what happened when a civilization internalized the reality of its situation. The shift to concentrated military traffic did give him a brief pause. He consulted the historical models. 3 of the 61 registered civilizations had shown a similar spike in military communications prior to registration. In all 3 cases, it had been the internal politics of a divided species managing the shock of first contact. None had presented organized external resistance. He noted the anomaly in his report. He did not alter course. What his sensors had also detected, and what his models had categorized as a minor observation, was the pattern of new objects appearing in the outer system over the previous 40 hours. Small. Non-propulsive, most of them. Drifting in a spread pattern consistent with passive monitoring deployment. The report flagged them as primitive observation infrastructure, no tactical significance. This was the second miscalculation. On Earth, in the EDCA Situation Room, Commander Tanaka was watching the same region of space from the other direction. His monitoring probes had detected the fleet at the heliopause, the boundary where the sun's solar wind gives way to interstellar space. At that distance, the fleet's individual vessels were resolved only as thermal signatures, but the count was clean, 12 distinct contacts, moving in a loose V formation at consistent velocity and bearing. Tanaka spent 40 minutes with the detection data before he called Admiral Voloshin. 12 ships, he said. Current velocity puts them inside Jupiter's orbit in approximately 19 days. Voloshin was quiet for a moment. Formation. Structured but not aggressive. It's not a strike formation, no separation into assault elements. They're moving together, same vector, same speed. It looks more like a convoy than a battle group. Weapons signatures? The probes can't resolve at that range. We don't know what they're carrying. He paused. But they're coming directly. No deviation. No communication attempt. They received our acknowledgement and they haven't responded. Humanity had sent its reply to the Council's signal 4 days earlier, a mathematical encoding using the Council's own structural format, incorporating a set of coordinates within Earth's orbital space as a suggested meeting point. Standard diplomatic protocol, mirroring the form of the original message. The fleet had not acknowledged it. They're not coming to negotiate, Voloshin said. No, Tanaka agreed. I don't think they need to. She looked at the trajectory model on her screen, the arc of 12 alien ships curving through the outer system, aimed with the unhurried precision of something that had done this before. Get me the fleet commanders on a secure channel, she said. All 17. Tonight. The call happened at 2100 hours Universal Time Coordinated, with 17 ship captains in locations ranging from low Earth orbit to the L2 monitoring station to a dry dock at the Lunar South Pole facility where the last 2 patrol vessels had been undergoing systems upgrades that were now being expedited at emergency priority. Voloshin did not give a speech. She gave a briefing. She told them what was coming. She told them what was known and she was precise about what was not. She told them about the formation, the velocity, the 19-day window. She told them that Earth had transmitted a diplomatic acknowledgement and received no response. Then she told them what she needed. Not heroes. Not sacrifices. Witnesses with weapons who were willing to hold a line and make contact absolutely impossible to misread. They've processed 100 civilizations, she said. 99 of them either submitted or were too small to do anything else. We're going to be different. Not because we think we can win a war in the outer system with 17 ships. We can't. But because the only thing worse than the conversation we're about to have is having it from a position where they never had to take us seriously at all. One of the captains, Commander Yusuf al-Rashid, commanding the patrol vessel Meridian, asked the question everyone in the call was probably thinking. Admiral, what are our rules of engagement? Voloshin looked at the trajectory on her screen one more time. Hold position. Maintain open communications. Do not fire first. She paused. But if they demonstrate hostile intent against Earth's sovereign space, respond. Proportionally, intelligently, and without hesitation. The channel held silence for a moment. Then al-Rashid said quietly, Understood. Earth had 19 days. It used every hour of them. 19 days is not a long time to prepare for first contact with an alien fleet. It is, however, enough time to make consequential choices, if the people making them are willing to be clear-eyed about what they have, what they lack, and what they can reasonably accomplish in the hours available. In the days following the fleet's detection, EDC operated on a planning cycle that compressed a year's worth of strategic decisions into 3 weeks, and the decisions made in that window would determine whether humanity's first military interaction with an alien power was a footnote or a turning point. The public was not told. Not yet. This was a decision that Voloshin disagreed with, and said so plainly to the Civilian Oversight Committee. Her argument was pragmatic rather than moral. Operational security around a 19-day window was largely illusory, because the moment the fleet passed inside Jupiter's orbit, amateur astronomers and private satellite operators would begin detecting anomalies. The cover story being developed, a gravitational lens event of unusual magnitude, would hold for perhaps 72 hours after the fleet became visually detectable. The committee overruled her. She noted her objection for the record and returned to work. What those 19 days produced was something that, from the outside, might have looked like improvisation. From the inside, it was coordinated logistics performed at a pace that the participating organizations had not previously believed themselves capable of. The 17 active patrol vessels were repositioned into 3 groups. The first group, 6 ships, took up a position at roughly $1.50 from Earth, in the plane of the ecliptic, directly along the incoming fleet's approach vector. Their designation was Forward Observation Group. They were not there to stop anything. They were there to be seen and to see. The second group, 7 ships, moved to a position at $0.80, inside Earth's orbit, in a spread formation covering a broad arc of sky relative to the approach corridor. They were designated Response Coordination Group. Their role, in the event of escalation, was to provide real-time sensor data, communications relay, and the option for coordinated maneuver. The third group, 4 ships including the 2 that had been pulled from the lunar drydock, remained in near-Earth space. They were the reserve. They were also, practically speaking, the ships most likely to matter if things went badly, because they were close enough to Earth to affect anything that entered Earth's immediate orbital environment. The 43 deployed monitoring probes were supplemented by an additional 29 emergency-launched units over the following week. By the time the Council fleet crossed the inner asteroid belt, Earth had 72 active sensors distributed across a volume of space that gave EDCA continuous tracking from multiple angles. This was the thing that the Council's models had failed to account for. Not the ships but the sensor network. Earth's patrol fleet was, in raw military terms, almost certainly outmatched. But Earth was not fighting blind. Every ship in the incoming fleet was being tracked continuously, by multiple independent systems, with redundant data links back to the Situation Room in Geneva and the Backup Operations Center buried in the Ural Mountains. In military intelligence, persistent surveillance of an adversary is not a small thing. It is the difference between reaction and anticipation. Simultaneously, the diplomatic track was escalating. Though escalating, in this case, meant an increasingly one-sided attempt at communication. Earth had now sent 4 transmissions toward the incoming fleet, each using the mathematical framework of the original Council signal, each offering the agreed-upon rendezvous point in Earth's L4 region as a meeting location. The L4 point had been chosen deliberately. It was far enough from Earth to feel non-threatening, but within the envelope where Earth's sensor network and patrol vessels could maintain clear situational awareness. The fleet had not responded to any of them. Dr. Osei and her team had expanded their decoding efforts during the 19-day window, working from every piece of the original signal that had not yet been fully analyzed. What they produced was not a complete translation. The Council's communication system was enormously complex, and the original signal was a formal notification rather than a conversational text, but it was enough to refine their understanding of what had been said. The phrase previously translated as "non-compliance will be corrected" was revised. The more accurate rendering, according to Osei's revised model, was something closer to "unresolved status will be resolved in accordance with standard procedure." The tone was not threatening in the human sense. It was procedural. "They don't think we're a threat," Osei told Voloshin during a briefing on day 14. "They think we're an administrative problem. Can you tell what the standard procedure is for resolving unresolved status?" Osei was quiet for a moment. "Based on the structural encoding, it involves physical inspection of the designated system. The inspection involves a set of, I'd call them assessments. Technical capability assessment. Population distribution. Level of interstellar activity." She paused. "And what appears to be a compliance determination. What happens after the compliance determination? The signal doesn't say. The data structure just ends there." Osei looked at her notes. "Which is interesting actually. Normal procedural documents encode the follow-up steps. The fact that this one doesn't suggest that either the follow-up is variable, case by case, or it's in a different document. Or they don't think we'd understand it," Voloshin said. "That too," Osei agreed. On day 16 something changed. The fleet altered its formation. The 12 ships, which had been traveling in the loose V configuration since detection, reorganized into a tighter grouping, 6 ships in a compact central cluster, flanked by 3 ships on each side in a wider escort pattern. Tanaka flagged it immediately. "It's a different kind of formation," he told Voloshin, pulling up the tracking data. "The central cluster is tighter. The ships are closer together and their power signatures have increased. The flanking ships have spread out, wider field of separation. What does that look like to you?" He was careful with his answer. In human naval terms, the central cluster looks like a protected asset package, high-value ships moving together for mutual defense. The flankers look like they've gone from transit to active escort posture. They're not cruising anymore. No. They've switched to an approach posture. He looked at her. They know where our ships are. They can see our forward observation group. Good, Voloshin said. Tanaka waited. I want them to see us, she said. The thing I don't want is for them to underestimate us. If they're changing formation because they've identified a structured deployment ahead of them, that means they're taking it seriously enough to respond to. She looked at the tracking display. That's better than them flying straight through like we're not there. She authorized a response to the formation change. The forward observation group was instructed to execute a simultaneous reorientation, all 6 ships turning on their long axes to present a different profile, in a move that was too coordinated to be coincidental. It was not aggressive. It was demonstrably deliberate. It said, "We see you seeing us." 3 hours later, for the first time since the original signal, the incoming fleet broadcast a transmission. It was short, heavily encoded. It took Osei's team 4 hours to produce a working translation. It said, essentially, identify yourself and state your authority to occupy this approach corridor. Voloshin read the translation twice. Then she smiled, not warmly, but with the specific satisfaction of someone whose fundamental reading of a situation had just been confirmed. They expected an empty approach, she said. Or something that would scatter. She set the paper down. Draft a response. Use their encoding. Tell them this corridor is monitored space under the authority of the government of Earth, and that our fleet is present to ensure any transit is conducted with appropriate prior coordination. Should we mention the rendezvous point again? Tanaka asked. Yes. Make it clear the offer is still open. She paused. But phrase the corridor authority statement first. The response went out 20 minutes later. The fleet's reply came in 6 hours. It was longer this time. Osei's team worked through the night. When the translation came back, it contained a phrase that stopped everyone in the room cold, not because it was threatening but because of what it implied about how the council understood the situation. The phrase read, "The authority you describe is not recognized within registered galactic administrative law." They did not yet know about Earth's fleet. They knew about the ships in the corridor. But they still did not know what was behind them. They were about to find out. 17 ships. No retreat orders. The moment that defined everything. The moment of closest approach between the Council's inspection fleet and Earth's forward observation group happened at 14:23 Universal Time Coordinated, at a distance that translated to approximately $1.40 from Earth, slightly inside Mars's orbit, in the vast cold space between the inner and outer solar system. There was no dramatic burst of light, no sound, no physical sensation. In space, proximity is defined by sensor data and calculations rather than human perception. The 6 ships of the forward observation group had been holding their position for 31 hours. Their crews had been on full alert status for the last 8. The Council fleet did not stop. It slowed. The distinction was important. Stopping would have implied either uncertainty or aggression, a gathering to strike or a hesitation born of doubt. Slowing was something else. It was a reassessment, the behavioral equivalent of a pause mid-stride to look more carefully at something in the path ahead. For 2 hours, the 12 Council ships and 6 Earth ships maintained their relative positions in a slow-motion encounter, separated by roughly 40,000 kilometers, close enough that Earth's best-resolution sensors could now image the alien vessels as distinct shapes rather than thermal signatures. What those images showed was sobering. The Council ships were large. Not in the science fiction sense of planet-sized impossibilities, but in the way that carrier groups are large, purposefully, functionally enormous. The smallest of the 12 was approximately 300 meters in length. The 3 largest, clustered at the center of the formation, were estimated at between 800 and 1100 meters. They were angular rather than streamlined. This was space and aerodynamics were irrelevant, and their hull configuration suggested modular construction, assembled rather than built whole. Practical. Industrial. Old in the way that a well-used tool is old, worn smooth in the places that bear the most wear. Commander Al-Rashid, aboard the Meridian, transmitted a brief observation to Admiral Voloshin's command post. They look like infrastructure, not warships. Voloshin forwarded the observation to the strategic analysis team and noted in her own log. Infrastructure, not warships. That tracks. But infrastructure can be armed. On day 17, the Council fleet broadcast again. This transmission was longer and more complex than anything they had sent previously, and Osei's team required nearly 6 hours to produce even a partial translation. When it came, it ran to 4 pages of dense, structured text. The substance, stripped of its bureaucratic encoding, was this. The fleet identified itself formally as an inspection and registration deployment operating under the authority of the Compact of Observed Systems, 4th Meridian Administrative Sector. It identified Earth, by its stellar coordinates, not by name, as a Class 3 emergent civilization that had crossed the threshold for mandatory registration review. The inspection was, per the transmission's language, a legally required procedural action under the administrative framework that governed the sector. Earth's deployment of armed vessels in the approach corridor was characterized as a procedural interference and was noted in the fleet's formal record. Earth was instructed to stand down its vessels, permit unobstructed access to the system's inhabited zone, and present itself for standard assessment within a defined time window. The time window given was 72 hours. There was no threat attached to the instruction. That was the thing that struck Osei when she read the translation. There was no, or else. It was simply assumed that the instruction would be followed, the way a customs directive assumes the traveler will present their documents rather than refuse. The possibility of refusal had not been encoded into the language of the communication. They don't have a word for it, she told Voloshin. Or if they do, it's in a register they don't think applies here. Because they've never had to use it with a civilization at our development level? Possibly. Or because the concept of a pre-registered civilization refusing assessment is, from their historical perspective, roughly equivalent to a person refusing to have a heartbeat. She paused. It's not something their system has modeled for. Voloshin sat with that for a long time. Then she drafted Earth's response. It took her 3 hours, working with the diplomatic team and the translation specialists, to produce something that used the Council's own encoding structure and matched, as precisely as possible, the register and formality of the Council's transmissions. It was important that it not sound angry or defiant or defensive. It had to sound like what it was, a considered, sovereign response from an entity that understood what it was saying. The response stated that Earth acknowledged receipt of the inspection fleet's formal identification and the stated purpose of the deployment. It stated that Earth had attempted to establish preliminary diplomatic contact on multiple occasions prior to the fleet's entry into the solar system and had received no response to those attempts. It stated that Earth recognized the administrative framework described by the Council but had not consented to, been consulted about, or been offered any avenue for participation in that framework. It stated that Earth's vessels were positioned in accordance with the sovereign authority of Earth's government to monitor and manage access to its home system, and that this posture would be maintained. Then it restated, for the 5th time, the offer of a rendezvous at the L4 point. And then, this was the sentence that Voloshin had spent the most time on, and that she had revised 8 times before she was satisfied with it. It said, Earth is prepared to discuss the terms of registration and to engage in good faith with the Council's administrative processes. Earth is not prepared to accept unilateral access to its home system without prior diplomatic engagement. These positions are not in conflict. The transmission went out. The 72-hour clock was running. Inside the forward observation group, the mood was, by the accounts of every crew member who later wrote about it, something that resisted easy categorization. Fear was present, but it was a specific kind of fear. Not panic, but the heightened alertness of people who understood what they were in the middle of and had decided, before they were in the middle of it, what they intended to do. There is a difference between courage and the absence of fear. These crews were not unafraid. They were committed. Commander Al-Rashid had his ship's systems set to continuous broadcast on the Council's frequency, not transmitting information but broadcasting the ship's identifier signal at regular intervals. It was a simple thing, almost trivially so. But it meant that the Council fleet, at every moment, received confirmation that Meridian was still there. Still present. Still choosing not to move. The hours passed. On hour 41 of the 72, the Council fleet's formation shifted again. The 3 central ships, the largest ones, began a slow separation from the escort cluster, moving forward on the original approach vector. Tanaka read the tracking data twice before calling Voloshin. The 3 large ships are separating from the formation. They're on a direct approach vector to Earth. Speed. Slow. Deliberate. Not an attack profile. He hesitated. But they're not stopping. And the 9 escort ships? Holding position. Watching. Voloshin looked at the mission clock. 31 hours remained in the window. The 3 Council ships were moving but slowly, at their current velocity, they would not reach Earth's orbital space for another 90 hours. Longer than the window. They were not rushing to enforce the deadline. They were making a statement: we are going to proceed regardless. She called the response coordination group. 7 ships, positioned inside Earth's orbit. All ships, this is Admiral Volushin. The Council fleet has initiated a partial forward movement. Forward observation group will maintain position. Response coordination group is to move to intercept vector, not to stop the approaching ships, but to be positioned directly in their path. Same posture as the forward group. Hold there. 7 ships began to move. The Council fleet was now looking at the reality that the 6 ships they had been watching were not the extent of Earth's deployment. There were 7 more maneuvering to meet them. And though the Council could not yet know it, there were 4 more behind those. The 9 escort ships that had been holding position began to move as well. The 72-hour clock had 58 hours left. Neither side had fired. Neither side had fled. They came expecting deference. Earth's fleet held cohesion under fire. What happened next was not a battle in the traditional sense. It would be classified in Earth's records as the first solar contact event, a designation that was careful, deliberately, to say neither battle nor diplomatic incident, because it was something between those categories that the existing vocabulary was not quite adequate to describe. It began on hour 54 of the 72-hour window. The 3 large Council ships, moving slowly through Earth's inner system on their approach vector, broadcast a new transmission. It was short. Osei's team had a translation within 2 hours. It contained 2 statements. The first acknowledged, in formal language, that Earth had deployed multiple vessels across the approach corridor. This was characterized as a registered complication in the inspection timeline. The second statement said that the complication did not alter the Council's mandate, and that a demonstration of the Council's enforcement capacity would be initiated. The demonstration, this was the word used in the translation demonstration, consisted of one of the 3 large ships firing on a single target. The target was one of Earth's passive monitoring probes, positioned approximately $1.10 from Earth, in the debris-cleared space between the inner asteroid belt's edge and the main body. The probe was small, automated, and unmanned. It had been deployed 4 weeks earlier as part of the sensor network expansion. It was not a ship. It did not have a crew. The Council knew this. The choice of target was not random. The probe was destroyed by a single pulse of directed energy that the tracking sensors measured at a duration of less than 2 milliseconds. It was not a weapon fired in anger. It was a weapon fired to show what a weapon could do, the way a lock is broken to demonstrate the breaking, not because there was something on the other side worth having. Edka's Situation Room received the sensor data 4.7 seconds after the event. Volushin read the tracking data twice. She looked at the energy signature. She looked at the thermal dissipation pattern of the destroyed probe, which had simply stopped existing as a coherent object. She looked at the range, $1.10. She looked at the dispersion pattern. The weapon had fired at a target approximately the size of a large automobile, at a distance of 160 million kilometers, and hit it with enough precision that the debris pattern was consistent with a clean center of mass strike. That was the message. Not the destruction of the probe. The precision. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Pull the probe network back. Bring everything inside $0.80. Tanaka looked at her. That gives them an open lane in the outer system. Yes. She had already worked through the calculation. They know where our probes are. If they're willing to demonstrate capability on unmanned assets, leaving probes in range is just giving them targets. Pull them back to where our ships can cover the gaps. The probe network repositioned over the next 4 hours, not scattered, not fleeing, but withdrawing to a defensible sensor arc closer to Earth. The coverage was thinner, but it was intact. The forward observation group did not move. This was the decision that would be analyzed at length in the months and years that followed. The probes had retreated. The ships had not. And the distinction to the Council fleet was either immediately clear or gradually became so, because over the 8 hours following the demonstration strike, the Council ships broadcast nothing and changed their approach velocity not at all. They were watching to see what Earth would do. What Earth did was hold. Al-Rashid's Meridian and its 5 companion ships remained in their positions, directly in the approach corridor. The response coordination group's 7 ships remained on intercept vector, positioned ahead of the 3 large Council ships like a visible line drawn across the flight path. None of them fired. None of them activated weapons systems in any way that the Council sensors could read as targeting acquisition. They simply remained there. This was the aspect of Earth's response that the Council had no historical data for. Withdrawal under a forced demonstration was expected. Every previous encounter in their records had produced some version of it. Total non-movement, not from some technical failure or strategic incapacity but from apparent choice, was new. Their behavioral models categorized it, eventually, as defiance. But that word, in their system, applied to civilizations that had mounted active resistance. Civilizations that had refused to yield but also refused to engage in threatening behavior occupied a category that the Council's taxonomy did not have a precise label for. They were not threatening Earth. Earth was not threatening them. Earth was simply in the way and was not moving. This was, from the Council's operational perspective, a procedural problem of a kind they had not previously encountered. On hour 61, the Council ships made a second demonstration. This one was aimed at the Meridian. The energy pulse was not fired at lethal power. The tracking data made this clear almost immediately. The signature was significantly lower than the pulse that had destroyed the probe. It struck the Meridian's aft hull at approximately 12% of the probe strike energy, enough to cause measurable hull heating, enough to trigger the ship's automated damage response protocols, enough to be unmistakably a deliberate impact and not a sensor ghost. Not enough to breach the hull. Not enough to injure the crew. A warning shot, calibrated with extraordinary precision. Al-Rashid's voice on the response channel was completely even. Meridian reports minor hull heating, aft section from a low-power energy strike. No structural damage. No casualties. All systems nominal. Holding position. The situation room was quiet for a moment. Acknowledged, Voloshin said. Are you requesting orders, Commander? A brief pause. No, Admiral. I know my orders. She looked around the room. Her chief analyst was watching her. Tanaka was watching her. The civilian oversight liaison had gone very pale. All ships EDCA actual. You have just witnessed a deliberate weapons strike on EDCA vessel Meridian within Earth's sovereign solar space. Rules of engagement remain unchanged. Hold position, do not fire first. However, she paused. All ships are authorized to bring active defensive systems fully online. Make this visible to Council sensors. Do not conceal it. The Response Coordination Group and the Forward Observation Group activated their defensive systems simultaneously. These were not, in raw capability terms, particularly formidable systems. Point defense arrays designed to intercept debris and micrometeorites, with a secondary capability to engage slower-moving objects at close range. Against the weapons that had just demonstrated their capability on the Meridian, they would have limited effect. But that was not why Voloshin had ordered them online. She had ordered them online because the Council's targeting systems would now see 17 human ships, in formation with active point defense arrays tracking the incoming fleet's vessels. The ships were not pointing weapons at the Council. They were demonstrating that they had weapons and were running them. In 16 minutes, a new transmission arrived from the Council fleet. It was 3 sentences. The first restated the Council's authority and mandate. The second stated that Earth's posture had been formally recorded and would be factored into the compliance determination. The third said, further resistance may result in greater force. Voloshin read it once. Then she drafted the response that would become, in all of Earth's subsequent records, the definitive statement of humanity's position in the first solar contact event. It said, Earth notes the Council's message. Earth's fleet will not withdraw from the approach corridor. Earth does not recognize the use of force as a substitute for diplomacy, regardless of the force's scale. If the Council proceeds with greater force, Earth will respond in kind with all assets available to it, while continuing to offer diplomatic resolution at the previously specified meeting point. Earth does not seek conflict. Earth will not yield to it. Tanaka read the draft over her shoulder. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, they'll know we can't match them. They already know that, she said. That's not the point. She looked at the draft. The point is they have to decide whether processing a civilization that won't yield is worth what it costs them. It's always been the calculation. The only question is whether we hold long enough for them to make it honestly. She sent the transmission. The 72-hour window expired 18 hours later. No further weapons were fired. The Council had models for submission. They had none for this. Senior Inspector Velharith had, in 26 years of service to the Compact of Observed Systems, conducted 43 registration inspections. He had administered compliance determinations for 9 civilizations, of which 4 had required some degree of enforcement action. In 2 of those cases, enforcement had involved weapons deployment. In no case had a civilization in the pre-registration phase, without interstellar travel capability, without FTL communications, without the technological infrastructure to have even left their home system in any significant numbers, responded to an enforcement demonstration by holding its fleet in place and transmitting a communication that contained the phrase, "Earth will respond in kind." He read the translation of Earth's last transmission 4 times. Then he called his operations council together. The operations council, the 5 senior officers of his inspection fleet, assembled in the command space of his flagship, which was the largest of the 3 lead vessels and was itself larger than any structure Earth had so far placed in orbit. They sat, by Earth's later reconstruction of the event, in a chamber that was roughly equivalent in function to a naval war room, and they discussed what had just happened. What had just happened was, in the Council's operational framework, genuinely anomalous. The forced demonstration against the probe had been intended to produce a measured withdrawal of Earth's network assets and, by extension, a softening of the patrol fleet's positioning. This was the pattern that the models predicted. The civilization would see its peripheral assets destroyed and would pull its more valuable assets back. Gradually, under sustained pressure, the fleet would reposition to closer to Earth, a defensive rather than an intercept posture, and the inspection ships could proceed. Instead, the probe network had repositioned but the fleet had not moved. And the subsequent low-power strike against an Earth vessel, calculated precisely to produce discomfort without casualties, to escalate the sense of danger without producing the kind of outrage that might cause an irrational response, had resulted in the target vessel broadcasting an immediate status report, receiving no new orders and continuing to hold its position. The fleet had not scattered. It had not charged. It had activated defensive systems in a way that was clearly visible to Council sensors and then simply remained where it was, transmitting a statement about diplomatic resolution. This was not a pattern. One of the Operations Council members, responsible for historical threat assessment, noted that of the civilizations in the Council's records that had mounted resistance to registration procedures, the resistance had always followed one of 2 forms: armed aggressive engagement, charging the inspection fleet, or passive withdrawal, pulling back but refusing to comply with assessment requirements. Neither form had been persistent. Aggressive engagement by a clearly outmatched force was quickly suppressed. Passive withdrawal eventually produced either compliance or a harder enforcement action. Earth was doing something that was not on either branch of that decision tree. "They're not attacking us," one officer said. "They're not retreating. They're maintaining a coordinated defensive deployment and continuing to transmit diplomatic communications. They sent us a meeting location," another noted. "For the 6th time. They want to negotiate," a third said. "But on their terms." Velharith looked at the star chart. The 17 Earth ships were distributed across 3 groups, in positions that demonstrated clear intentionality and organizational coherence. The fleet had been in place for days. The crews were not fresh. By any biological calculation, they had been under significant stress for an extended period. And yet the deployment had not degraded. "What is the compliance determination model?" he asked the threat assessment officer. The officer consulted the formal records. For a civilization of this classification, non-compliance with initial inspection protocols triggers an escalating enforcement sequence. The sequence begins with a forced demonstration, proceeds to selective asset destruction, then to restricted access enforcement and finally, he paused, to systemic suppression of the capability generating the resistance. Velharith was quiet for a long time. "What does that mean for this civilization specifically?" he asked. "What assets generate their resistance? What do we suppress?" The threat assessment officer understood the question. He answered it carefully. "Their fleet. Their orbital infrastructure. Possibly their communication networks which coordinate the deployment." "And after that? What does the assessment of their inhabited zone look like?" "Standard residential and industrial distribution. Population centers primarily in a habitable band. Technology index consistent with early class 3. No interstellar capability. No off-world population significant enough to constitute a strategic asset. So if we suppress the resistance, we suppress a small fleet, some satellites, we are then conducting an inspection of a civilization that has watched us destroy their military capability." Velharith leaned back. "Without any of that being requested, agreed to or explained to their population. Without any communication exchange beyond a series of administrative notices they received no preparation for." The council was quiet. "The mandate permits this," the administrative officer said carefully. "The mandate permits many things," Velharith said. I'm asking whether this is wise. What Velharith did next was unprecedented in his sector's administrative records. He transmitted a direct request to the Council's 4th Meridian Regional Authority for a consultation order, effectively a pause in the inspection timeline pending higher-level review of the compliance enforcement approach. The request would take several days to process. The Council's communication infrastructure, while vastly more advanced than Earth's, still operated on signal delays within the sector. The regional authority was not nearby, but the request was sent. And while it was pending, Velharith ordered his fleet to halt its forward movement. The 3 lead ships stopped. The escort cluster maintained position. The fleet was still in Earth's solar system, still close enough to be tracked clearly by every one of Earth's monitoring assets. But it was not advancing. On Earth, the tracking data produced a moment of controlled bewilderment in Edka's situation room. "They've stopped," Tanaka said. Volushan looked at the plot. 12 ships, stationary relative to Earth's reference frame, in positions that had them scattered across a wide region of the inner solar system but none of them approaching. "Why?" someone said. "I don't know," she said. "But get me Dr. Osei. I want to know if there's been any transmission we haven't fully decoded." There was, and when it was finally analyzed 4 hours later, it turned out to be not a transmission to Earth but a transmission in the direction of the outer system, encoded in a format that Osei identified as the Council's administrative communication register rather than its operational one. "They called someone," Osei said. "They called their regional authority." She looked at the analysis. The encoding structure is consistent with a request for instruction. She paused. "They're asking what to do." In the situation room something shifted. Not relief, it was far too early for that. The fleet was still there in Earth's solar system with its capability intact. The compliance window had expired. The situation remained tense in every objective measure. But the fleet had stopped moving. It had stopped firing. And it had asked a question. "They've encountered something their models don't account for," Volushan said. She sat with that for a moment. And their first response wasn't to escalate. It was to think. "That's either very good news," Tanaka said quietly, "or it means the answer that comes back from their authority is something much larger." "Both things can be true," she said. "Both things are probably true." She looked at the fleet plot one more time. But right now, in this moment, they stopped because of 17 ships that held their position and kept offering to talk. She stood up from her console. "Someone get me the UN Secretary General. It's time to tell Earth what happened." Earth was not what the Council expected. That was the point. The full story was made public 11 days after the fleet halted, not because Earth's governments had decided the time was right, but because 3 separate independent astronomers, an amateur satellite tracker in the Netherlands, and a crowdsourced analysis forum had collectively assembled enough publicly available telescope data and electromagnetic anomaly readings to publish a detailed, largely accurate account online. The controlled disclosure narrative was abandoned within 6 hours. Secretary General Adiz Nwofer gave the address that has been cited in every subsequent retrospective account of the contact event. Calm, precise, and notable above all for what it did not contain. No triumphalism. No fear. No attempt to minimize the severity of what had occurred. It described what had happened: the signal, the fleet, the 19-day preparation window, the weapons demonstrations, the holding of the line, and it stated plainly that the situation remained unresolved and that diplomatic engagement was ongoing. The world received this information in every possible way simultaneously. The consultation request Velharith had sent to the 4th Meridian Regional Authority was processed 11 days after it was submitted. The response, when it came, was not what the Operations Council had expected. The regional authority requested a full transmission of the encounter record, all tracking data, all communications logs, all compliance assessment data from the inspection fleet's time in the system. The request was unusual. Normally, compliance determination was an on-site commander's decision, and regional review was reserved for cases involving significant enforcement action or civilizational loss of function. The full record was transmitted. 12 days later, the regional authority sent a second response. This one contained 3 elements. The first was a formal acknowledgement that the inspection deployment had encountered an anomalous resistance pattern outside the scope of standard compliance protocols. The second was the suspension of the standard compliance timeline pending a special assessment review, a rarely invoked procedure that escalated the civilization's case to a higher tier of the Council's administrative structure, one that involved broader deliberation and, crucially, the possibility of modified registration pathways. The third element was a direct instruction to Velharith. Open formal communication with the civilization's designated representatives at the meeting location they have specified. It had taken Earth 17 days to prepare a defense and 7 weeks of continued holding, monitoring and transmitting to produce a request for a meeting from the Council's own administrative hierarchy. The meeting would take place at L4. The L4 meeting is outside the scope of this account. It lasted many weeks, involved delegations of considerable complexity on both sides, and produced a set of preliminary agreements that took years to ratify. What belongs here is the accounting of what had been accomplished and how. Earth had not defeated the Council fleet. The honest balance sheet of capability made this clear. The 12 ships that had entered the solar system were, individually and collectively, more powerful than anything Earth had or could have deployed. The probe network could track them, it could not stop them. The patrol fleet could hold position. In a sustained engagement at full Council enforcement capacity, it would not have held for long. But the calculation of power is never purely material. What Earth had demonstrated, across the full length of the contact event, from the first positioning of the forward observation group to the final transmission before the fleet halted, was something that the Council's models did not weight adequately, because the Council had not encountered it in a pre-registered civilization before. It was not aggression. It was not technology. It was organizational coherence under sustained pressure. 17 ships, crewed by people who understood they were outmatched, had maintained a structured, disciplined, non-escalatory deployment for weeks. They had absorbed a weapons demonstration. They had absorbed a direct strike. They had activated defensive systems without firing. They had continued transmitting diplomatic offers throughout. And they had done all of this without fragmenting, without breaking formation, without any vessel making an unauthorized move. In military terms, this was not extraordinary. Fleets have held positions under fire throughout human history, whenever the people in them decided that holding was more important than surviving by retreat. What made it notable in the context of the contact event was that Earth had done it with no doctrine for first contact, no experience of alien engagement, no certainty about whether the line they were drawing had any meaning to the people on the other side. They had held anyway. Dr. Osei, in her academic account of the contact event published 3 years later, noted that the Council's internal communications, partially decoded in the years following the meeting through a collaborative translation effort between Earth's linguists and a Council archivist who had become what could only be described as fascinated, showed that the encounter had forced a formal review of the Council's classification system. The category of pre-emergent civilization was subdivided, with a new subclassification created specifically to address what the Council's analysts termed anomalous organizational cohesion in the absence of superior capability. The new subclassification was assigned to one civilization. Admiral Voloshin retired from the EDCA 3 years after the contact event, at the conclusion of the preliminary registration negotiations. Her retirement address was short. It contained one passage that was quoted widely in the years that followed, not because it was grand, she was constitutionally allergic to grandeur, but because it was precise in a way that people found useful. We were never going to win a war in our own solar system against a fleet that had been doing this for 11,000 years. Anyone who told you we were didn't understand the math. What we could do and what we did was make the cost of ignoring us higher than the cost of talking to us. That's not victory. That's just the minimum requirement for being taken seriously. Everything else is what comes after. Commander Al-Rashid remained in service for another decade. The Meridian's aft hull section, where the Council's calibrated warning strike had caused the measured burn mark that all the early sensor reports had catalogued, was preserved intact during the ship's next scheduled maintenance cycle. The burn mark was not repaired. It was photographed, analyzed, formally documented, and left exactly as it was, not as a scar but as a record. A thing that had happened, that had been survived, and that had meant something. The forward observation group's 6 ships were eventually decommissioned as Earth's orbital capability expanded in the years following the contact event, a direct consequence of the resources unlocked by the registration negotiations, which opened limited technology exchange channels. Each ship was preserved at a different location. One at the Lunar South Pole facility, one at the L2 station, for in geosynchronous orbits that kept them permanently in Earth's sight, visible to any telescope pointed in the right direction. They are still there. Not as monuments to victory. As reminders of a specific moment, when the question of what humanity would do when the universe arrived unannounced was not answered in a speech or a policy paper, or a theory of civilizational superiority. It was answered by 17 crews who held their positions, kept their weapons cold, kept their communications lines open, and did not move. The universe had asked a question. Earth had answered it honestly.